Okay, let's get started. Once again, welcome everyone. My name is Shurja Sen. I am a program officer with the National Human Genome Research Institute in Bethesda, Maryland. I am extremely excited to bring to you a funding opportunity for use of my institute's Anvil cloud platform, and I'll give you much more details about what Anvil is and what we have on offer. A few quick logistics things. I only have maybe 17 or 18 slides, so I expect at most a third of this hour to be about me presenting what we have on offer. Afterwards, we encourage you strongly to ask your questions. We have the text function enabled, and feel free to type your questions into the chat as I keep presenting. And once I'm done, we will collect those and make sure we all get you an answer. My colleague Mike Lopez is on the call as well. Mike will help me make sure that no question typed in the chat goes unanswered. If by any chance your question did not get answered, my email will be on different parts of this presentation. Feel free to reach out by email, or also just feel free to raise your hand once I'm done speaking, and we will make sure that we call on you to ask your question live. So with that, I'm going to get started. This is exciting time for us in genomics because cloud computing and genomics are increasingly converging and making things possible that just a few years ago would have been hard to do. Before I get too deep into the funding opportunity itself, I want to briefly tell you about my office. I am within the Office of Genomic Data Science at NHGRI. This is where all of our funding and our activity that connects computational biologists, mathematicians, statisticians, people that are coming at genomics from a quantitative perspective, together with all of the other experimental or clinical aspects of genomics. So think of this office as being your first point of contact if you have anything going on which is a mix of quantitative and purely genomic research. And we love hearing from you. We usually have funding opportunities that will capture to some extent or fully what you have in mind. And you are our target audience. So if you ever have a question, please reach out to this office. OGDS is the acronym we often use for it, and the website at the bottom. And all of these slides I'll send out later, so you have an easy way of finding it. But within OGDS, one of the biggest things that we have been doing for the last few years is promoting the move of genomic data science from siloed local infrastructures into the cloud. And our platform for doing this is Anvil. Anvil is an acronym for Analysis, Visualization, and Informatics Lab Space, but no one calls it that. We just call it Anvil. And what Anvil is in a sense, an effort to change the paradigm of people with large or small genomics data sets doing their work in their own environments, to everyone coming together and having access to essentially unlimited computing and humongous amounts of publicly accessible data and tools and user resources to do genomics as a community in the cloud environment. And what I'm going to tell you about today is one of the ways in which we hope that over the next few years, more and more people will realize that the cloud has something unique to offer them for their genomics research. So let's learn a little bit more about what Anvil is, because many of you may not have heard of the platform before. So let's take a few minutes to go over some basics of Anvil. So the easiest way to think of Anvil is as a resource. It is a cloud environment, but on this environment, we have tremendous amounts of data. We have elastic computing infrastructure. We have tools. We have a lovely user outreach and education group. And we have, in many ways, different ways to fund research to be done on the Anvil. So the top level view of Anvil is that this is a scalable and interoperable computing resource for the genomics community based on cloud platforms. A slightly different way of thinking about the same platform is that this is a mix of three important aspects. As I'll tell you in a few more slides, we have what I believe is the single largest repository of human genomic data from many consortia, many individual users, highly used data sets like GTEx, which are expression data sets, clinical data sets. So Anvil really hosts what I believe is a treasure trove of data for anyone doing genomics of anything, of any sort of the human variety. But this is not just about data. We have also built into Anvil tools, the most commonly used tools such as Jupyter, Bioconductor, Galaxy, RStudio, Whittle, Dockstore, pretty much all of the tools that are used to process large-scale genomic data outside of the cloud have also been adapted and made available for use on the Anvil cloud environment. So it's data and it's tools. But probably the most important thing to remember is that if you're new to the cloud, it's also a community. With Anvil, we have funded excellent groups of educators and trainers, and we have a large community of Anvil users at this point who are always willing to help share their experiences or help a new user get over their initial hurdle. So in that sense, the third biggest piece of Anvil is the community. So once again, what we bring to you is a mix of data, tools, and a community of users that will help you make the transition from non-cloud genomics to genomics on the cloud. And I do believe that this has something to offer, even if you haven't been too enthusiastic about the cloud before. So among the most important things that we try to emphasize with Anvil is the availability of data at a scale which just a few years ago would have been almost impossible to imagine. With this graph, I'm showing you what is already out of date because we have even more than what I show you here. But Anvil is a repository for well over 600,000 genomes, almost at this point, 6 petabytes of data already available, even more that is being processed and cleaned and soon will be available. And these are not just genomes, they come with metadata, they come with clinical phenotypes. So this is really, at this point, probably the world's biggest repository of research data that can be reused and asked and interrogated for different questions in future projects. And that's in a sense what we'll come to with this particular funding opportunity. But if you've ever done genomics and if you've ever said, I really wish I had access to that data set, or I really wish I had access to more samples, chances are that Anvil would be the solution to that bottleneck that you faced in the past. So, which brings us to this particular funding opportunity that I am excited to share today. What we want to do with RFA 8G25005, or Enhancing Reuse of NHGRI Data Assets, is to help you find new and innovative ways to ask questions from Anvil data that give these data sets a new life of their own and allow secondary analysis to bring new hypotheses to the surface. So let's, from this point onwards, I'm going to transition into talking about the funding opportunity. But of course, I'm happy to answer Anvil questions as well. So the purpose of this funding opportunity is, as I said, to encourage the community, which in this case is you, to leverage data sets and tools available through Anvil for innovative research and secondary analysis projects. So what this means is someone could have put a data set on Anvil because NHGRI requires people to submit their research data to the Anvil. And it could have been generated for one original purpose, but we have learned that secondary analysis is increasingly bringing out new uses from previous data sets. So if something is on Anvil and you study a different topic, chances are that with enough data, there might be a use for these original data sets that fits your needs and also gives a new life and lets you generate new hypotheses for your research, leveraging things that are on Anvil. This is a small grant opportunity. We are using the RO3 mechanism, and I'll talk more about that. But we have a strong suspicion that secondary analysis projects will often generate preliminary data that we hope will become the starting point for future larger funding applications, which of course would also be supported through Anvil for the computational aspects. So this is our effort to bring the genomics community, once again, everyone on this webinar, to Anvil and help them to learn what can be gained from this platform that we funded over the last 5 or 10 years. So what are a few examples of secondary analysis? The most simple things that come to mind are things that are individual data sets that were originally generated for one scientific question, but may have a different use in a different context. Think of someone who generated heart disease genomes and put them on the Anvil. But it turns out that a certain number of these could also be a test bed for someone that has a variant that they think is linked with type 2 diabetes. So it's just using existing data in a new scientific context. Another example is what I would call increasing sample size. If you have 2 or 3 cohorts on Anvil, that could be combined into one synthetic larger cohort that gives you greater statistical power for asking a genomics question. That is also commonly done in secondary analysis projects with NIH data. Other examples are combining your own data with Anvil data. So we are allowing the use of individual data sets that are not on Anvil for this funding opportunity, as long as you combine it with something that is already hosted on Anvil. So think of something you were doing in your own lab, in your own HPC environment, and you wanted to use a bigger computing environment with more elastic computing capability or just larger numbers of samples. So you could bring your own data sets onto Anvil as long as they're getting combined with something on Anvil to increase the value of the combined project. So a few things conversely are not in scope. This particular funding opportunity does not include the ability to spend any of the money on new data generation. So no experimental costs. This is a completely computationally focused funding opportunity. The other important thing is this is focused on Anvil as a cloud platform. So we are not accepting applications that propose really interesting genomics but happen to use a different cloud platform. We believe that we have made Anvil a place where all of the tools and much of the data are available for people to use. So this is Anvil centric. And there is a pretty major focus on using the cloud in a way where someone that comes later has an easy way of reproducing any science done. So we have a request for well annotated workspaces to be generated as part of this funding. So a few things that I would like everyone to keep in mind. Basically, these are what we call non-responsive applications. And if it is a complex question, if you have an idea in your mind and you're wondering, does this fit with the funding opportunity? If you don't get the answer from just reading the funding opportunity, just reach out to me using that email below. And it really is always an exciting part of my job to discuss individual ideas and say, sure, that is a perfect fit with what we have in mind. Please go ahead and apply. But I would like all of you to consider just asking the question and making sure that we have a chance to talk before you submit. It's always a little unpleasant when someone takes a lot of time to submit and we learn later on that it was not a fit for what we had in mind. So just an invitation to begin that conversation, and we will help you determine if the work you have in mind is responsive to this funding opportunity. So a few things about the structure. This is an RFA for those of you who have done NIH applications before. What that means is there is money set aside. You will not be competing with the general pool of applications. You will be competing with others who applied specifically to this funding announcement. This is using the RO3 mechanism, that's the small research projects. The budget cap is $125,000 per year. This is for a 2-year period. We are expecting funds permitting to make between 5 and 7 awards for each of these 2 years. What can this money be used for? You can use it to fund a postdoc. You can use it to fund your own salary. You can use it for costs for the cloud, for compute, for storage. And we are planning an annual community conference where all of the awardees from this RFA would meet Anvil and would meet existing users and NHGRI staff. So a small part of this budget should also be set aside for traveling to this annual Anvil community conference. We just had the inaugural one at Cold Spring Harbor, and it was a tremendously exciting event. This is loosely going to be coordinated by program staff like myself and Anvil's outreach team. So we won't be breathing down your necks asking how things are going, but expect to be loosely in touch with Anvil, asking if you have any pain points or if you're making the sort of progress you wanted to. This is also a time for Anvil to receive feedback. The Anvil platform itself is about 5 years old and just about hitting the prime time in terms of usage. So we might be asking for your help in giving us some feedback on Anvil as you get deeper into the usage experience. A few deadlines. There is no letter of intent for this, so you are welcome to go all the way up to the final receipt date. The first receipt date is on February 13th of next year, and another receipt date exactly on that day the following year. One more of these webinars at the end of January next year. So a chance for me to answer any remaining questions or give you some feedback on a proposal that you've been writing up to this point. Very, very important. Every year we have the unfortunate instance of talking to people who waited until February the 12th to submit, and then there was an internet issue, or NIH's website was down, or someone at their local institution in the sponsored programs office was on leave, and someone that spent months writing an application didn't get to submit. So if there's one thing I want you to take away from this webinar, it's don't wait until the day before or even the week before. It always works better to submit as early as you can. And if we can help with giving you feedback on your science, we can do that anytime between now and January or February, but just don't wait until the last minute. So to reinforce that same point, contact me before submitting if I can help, and if you have any questions whatsoever. If NIH applications are not something you've done 100 times before, the SF 424 application guide is not exactly the most exciting document to read, but it has every single piece of information that is needed for a successful application to be submitted. So go back and read that, or at least consider reading it once, so it gives you all of the pieces needed for this. It has standard formats for things that are the research plan, and they're pretty easy to fill in. And this is a small funding announcement, so not a whole lot of extra pieces in there. But if you haven't done this before, this is a good time to take a quick look at both the SF424 and also the PHS 398 format. And once again, reading the RFA itself 2 or 3 times is always a good starting point, so you know exactly which things are asked for, like a resource sharing plan or a data management and sharing plan. So once again, a little bit of specific information for this funding opportunity. When you go back and read the RFA, I really encourage you to go to this section. This has a few things which are specific and unique to this funding opportunity, and really sort of are focused on the cloud. So I'm going to just not get into too much detail on this webinar, but walk you through a few of these so that they stick in your mind. If you are using human data sets, we are asking for a justification for why the specific data sets that you want to use on Anvil are the appropriate ones for your research. If you're bringing your own data onto Anvil, please describe any limitations on the use of these data by Anvil is a place for data sharing. So we want people to be able to use any data on the platform. So give us a sense of any limitations on these data sets that you will bring onto the platform, and also your ability and willingness to submit these as Anvil datasets for future users. Data access is a topic. You might have to go through dbGaP or Duos to obtain access. That takes certain amounts of time, weeks, months. So give us a sense of if you already have access privileges to any data sets that you would use for this application. And if you don't have them at this point, a sense of when you plan on applying for them, so that by the time an award gets made, you have the ability to start using Anvil and you're not using 6 months out of your 2-year award period waiting for the access privileges to come about. Once again, the final piece of this is if there are non-Anvil data that you plan on using, we want these to be something that is also available to everyone else, not a protected data set that is isolated from the rest of the genomics community. So just a description of how any of these non-Anvil data are accessible to others through a publicly controlled database, and how others would get the same ability to use these data as you have. So with that, let's get into review. This is a review process that will be convened by NHGRI. We call it a special emphasis panel. In simple terms, that means that the reviewers will have probably more of a awareness of what Anvil is, and we will be able to brief them on the specific goals of this RFA. The review gives a score. That is a starting point. We take things and the applications and their scores to NHGRI's council for approval to fund. Council gives us more input on whether specific applications or specific funding plans are approved. And then program officers are able to make a few funding determinations based on how much money we have, whether the review scores were in a fundable zone. So this just gives you the sense that that first level of peer review is a great start, but there are a couple of other layers, especially in these budgetary constraints that we face at NIH now, before we can make a funding announcement. And I'm going to wrap up here by just saying that there are things that we ask for in this particular funding announcement. Anvil has a cloud-based cost estimator that you can use to derive an ballpark number for how much your compute is going to cost. We do require a cloud cost estimate to be submitted with your application. NIH has mandatory requirements to submit a data management and sharing plan and a resource sharing plan. So both of those are reviewers will be looking out for those. So don't forget to include those two. And finally, as I said, we want you to come join us for next year's community conference. So please make sure to include costs for that in your budgets. So I'm going to wrap up by saying that what we want to do here is to maximize the return on existing data. We have these 600,000 or more genomes on Anvil. We have the tools. We have a user community. Now it is time for us to connect with you and make sure that these things just don't stay there unutilized, and instead for us to convince you that there is value for your research in using these resources available through Anvil. And we hope that through this, new hypothesis will get generated, new discoveries will be made. And in a broader sense, because Anvil itself is a fairly new platform, this is also a test of truth for whether we build something that is proving useful to you in your future research. So with that, I'm going to thank a few people who helped build this funding announcement, put that funny cartoon up there for a couple of minutes. And then at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen in full screen. And if you have questions, I see a few coming into the chat. Mike, could we start with one or more of these questions and see if others have things to type in while I answer that?
Sure. So two of the questions we have are kind of similar, so I'm going to ask them at the same time. The first one is there a link available where basic information on the NHGRI datasets could be available for
Yes.
exploring before application development?
Yes, absolutely. So that's a really good question. I'm going to, while I keep talking in the next few minutes, I'm going to put something in the chat, which is Anvil's Data Explorer. Because there is so much data on Anvil, we built a tool for people to browse and organize it and see what exists that is appropriate for their research. So in just a few minutes, I'm going to try to put something in the chat, which is the specific answer for that. But we have a tool. And if you have any questions offline, I'm happy to answer those as well. But we want to make this as easy as possible for you to find in terms of data and tools on the Anvil. Okay, I see another question about my slides on the website where you registered for this webinar. We will make both this recording as well as a copy of the slides available. So access to those should happen over the next couple of days or so. Okay, I see one more. There is a due date on February 13, 2026. That could be two things. It could be someone who applied to the February 13, 2025, got a review score that is just outside the funding zone and wants to try another submission. So the 2026 date could be a resubmission date. Or alternatively, we do expect that many people will apply for the first time to that date as well. So you have a second chance. If you want to try this upcoming one in February of 25, the 26 is a way for you to resubmit, or you could decide to wait and submit in 2026, although I wouldn't advise that. Okay, I'm going to come to the one on program priorities. This is a complex question. I would suggest initiating an email conversation. We don't have specific disease endpoints at the Genome Institute. We focus on genomics as a whole. So our program priorities in this case would be just making sure that you have a chance to take Anvil out on a high-speed test drive. But let's get you an answer that is a little more specific. If you reach out to me by email, I will find a time to talk and tell you if what we have in mind is matching what your priorities are. Okay, and then the final question I see in the chat is, can non-award recipients also use Anvil? Absolutely, yes. Anvil is for anyone that wants to do genomics. Log on to the Anvil, create an account. It doesn't cost a whole lot of money to do basic things on the Anvil, sometimes as low as tens or hundreds of dollars. So pretty much anyone that wants to do genomics is able to use Anvil. You do not need to have an award through this funding announcement or any funding announcement to be an Anvil user. We hope that Anvil users will come from countries where funding is not always available. We built this so there is substantial ability for people to do genomics at fractional costs. And these are all great questions. I'm going to work with Mike and make a frequently asked questions document that we will also post on the website. But all of these questions are fair ones for today's webinar. If you have a question that you would rather ask live, please raise your hand. My colleagues here on my AV team will put you in audio mode, so you can also ask it with your microphone rather than type it into the chat. Jacob, I see we have Saurav. Saurav, you should be able to speak now.
Hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Surya, for the presentation. So I was wondering, since it is like $125,000 per year funding, do you expect this to be from a single lab or like collaborative between, or if subcontracts are available, would be possible?
There are no restrictions. You can collaborate, you can build a team. It is by NIH standards a small funding announcement capped at 125. So it would be unusual for 10 collaborators to come together. But on the other hand, there's absolutely no reason that a group of 2 or 3 scientists would not decide to split this up and do subcontracts from the prime awardee to other collaborators. So to answer your question, the simple answer is yes, you can have a sub-award in your application.
Okay, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Other questions?
We have a few more questions in the chat.
Go ahead, call them out.
The first one is going to be, can we access all the data from Anvil, or will we need to submit separate applications for each data set for use in the analysis?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. No need to access requests are handled on a dataset by dataset basis. So you wouldn't need to submit a separate grant application for each dataset. This funding opportunity, you would submit one grant application that combines the use of all of the data. But the access request to dbGaP or DUOS would need to be handled on the basis of individual datasets. So if that makes sense, once again, to recap, do the work beforehand to make sure you have the access. But after you have that, the application to this is one single application that combines all of these data sets into the science or the project that you have in mind. So no need to submit 2 applications for this funding opportunity if you have 2 data sets that are different components of the same project.
Great. We have another question similar to Anvil.
Go
Someone
ahead.
was saying that they had a chat with a potential collaborator yesterday about a data set in Anvil and that they don't see that data set on the Data Explorer. Are awards only limited to those visible in DE in the Data Explorer?
No, it might be a question of the Data Explorer being a thing that is always in an active state of construction. I'm happy to take this particular question offline, but the short answer is there is no limitation to data sets that are just visible in Data Explorer. In fact, it might be the case that in a few days, this data set that was not visible becomes visible. It is a relatively new part of Anvil, and I know that new things are coming into it every week as we speak. But once again, there is no limitation to things that are visible within the Data Explorer.
Great. And now we got another question. Does Terra support Nextflow?
I believe it does. My Terra colleagues can give the more nuanced answer to that, but I have heard that question come up before, and I believe the answer is yes, it does.
All right, and another question. Is there any citizenship restrictions? And also, can grad students on a visa apply?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. There are no restrictions on foreign applicants, but the applicant would need to be eligible within their institution to apply for NIH funding. And in almost all cases, individual universities or academic institutions, research institutions are going to require that the applicant be a PI, the chief of a lab or a staff scientist. So a grad student could easily be funded through this. There are no restrictions on the funding, but the applicant themselves would probably need to be someone that has a little more seniority, unless an institution allows grad students to apply as individuals in their own right, which is extremely rare. So if you are a grad student, Kushal, I would advise talking to your PI and saying, I really want to do this. If I help write the application, would you be willing to submit it in your PI role? But there are no citizenship restrictions. I was an international grad student myself, and luckily compute is not linked to passports. So if your PI is willing to submit the application, you could do the work on this irrespective of which country your citizenship is from.
All right, great. Another question is asking, is NHGRI still providing awards to projects not related to Anvil?
If it relates to science that is basic science and has no computation, the answer is yes. We fund all sorts of research that do not involve a computational aspect and hence would not connect to Anvil. If this is an NHGRI award or an NHGRI application that involves computational science, we are not requiring, but we expect or hope that Anvil will be part of the applicant's plans for data submission. At least for data submission, it has to be submitted to Anvil. But also we hope that applicants will consider using Anvil as their platform for processing data. So the answer here would be yes, we make tons of awards to projects that have nothing to do with Anvil. But if it is a computational project or if it is producing genomic data of any sort, those would need to be submitted on Anvil.
Great. And another person asked, if you could clarify where to find the program priorities for this grant.
Yeah, the best place to look at that is we have a purpose section. I'm going to see if I can share the part of this. I have the funding opportunity up here. So let me quickly share my screen for just a second. And that should bring up where we listed this out. So reading of this part, which is purpose and below it non-responsive applications. So this is the best part to look at program priorities. But as I was saying, program priorities is a complex question, and it's much, much safer to have an offline conversation with myself or someone else on the Anvil team so that we can give you a 100% confirmed answer as to whether the science you have in mind is a match with program priorities. It's not really feasible to describe all of our program priorities within the space of one funding announcement. This part of the text should give you an initial idea, but after reading it, I really, really encourage you to reach out to me or anyone on the Anvil website.
Sergio, can I add something? I just put on the chat the link to our funding policy, to NHGRI's funding policy for 2024. We do talk about a lot of our program priorities in there. That could be a good starting point.
Thank you so much, Valentina. Mike, what else we got?
We got another.
Kate, thank you so much for answering the TEDA question. I'm happy you're here.
We have another question asking if can researchers overseas, non-US applicants apply?
Yes, we did not restrict this to US applicants. There are NIH requirements on things like DUNS registrations and SAM numbers. So anyone in any country can apply. But if you're not already familiar with the US or NIH grant application system, you might need to make sure that all of the administrative pieces are already in place for an NIH submission. This is a little more involved than just filling out the application format and submitting it. Before you can submit, there are certain administrative steps that need to be taken care of. But the important part of this is there is no restriction on a particular country or set of countries for applying. Anyone, foreign components and foreign applications are allowed for this funding opportunity.
Great. And then we have one more question. Is it within scope to include a community-based / educational component in our grants, in addition to the basic research on the platform? Is that a strategic priority?
This is a really interesting question. So we do a ton of educational projects on Anvil. And in a sense, for the Office of Genomic Data Science, educational work in genomics and computational genomics particularly is a high priority. So in that sense, use of Anvil data to build an application that is community building among professors or teachers is certainly something that is of high interest to us. If that's the sort of thing you have in mind, if you could send me a very brief description, a paragraph or less of what you have in mind, I can read it and I can give you a better feedback. But in general, it's something that we do a lot of and we have a lot of excitement about. I see a point about participating in this webinar. Was that a country restriction? I've seen registrants from quite a few different countries, so I'm not sure if that restriction refers to a country of origin in terms of registering. We certainly didn't intend for that to be the case. Okay, any other questions? Okay. Once again, my email address is shurjo.sen@nih.gov. That's shurjo.sen@nih.gov. And not just about this funding opportunity, but about Anvil or computational genomics in general. I'm always happy to hear from you and help answer any questions. If we have no other questions, I'm going to wish everyone a happy holiday season. And thank you all for joining us. So Jacob, in about 10 seconds, we should be able to go off live.